Great to see you tonight. And how many of you have not been with us the previous 4 sessions? Any of you? Okay, well, welcome. We're glad you're here. And in case you don't know about Answers in Genesis and building the ark, or the museum in northern Kentucky, it's a beautiful 70,000 square foot museum and 50 acres, nature trails, walking bridges, waterfalls, a petting zoo. You can actually ride the camel, and a zip line course through the woods. And then inside, we've got animatronic dinosaurs and a real dinosaur fossil. This one was given to the museum. We have 97% of the skull and 50% of the skeleton. It's been professionally prepared and valued at over $1 million. And our geologist is doing research on the skull, CT scans, to analyze, learn what we can from that fossil. We also have 1% of Noah's Ark built to scale, and you can go inside. And we have a flood geology room, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight, how the flood relates to the rocks of the earth. World-class planetarium, amazing insect collection, and a great bookstore. So encourage you to come to the Creation Museum, and then while you're there, you need to spend 2 days so that you can go the second day to the Ark Encounter, which is built to scale according to the biblical dimensions and almost completely out of wood. And we show people how they could have stored food and water, how they could have lived, their living conditions. If they could build an ark, they obviously would have been thinking of comfortable accommodations for themselves. And Noah is animatronic, and we have animals in cages, and we answer the skeptical questions people have. How many animals were on the ark? What did the carnivores eat? What did they do with all the manure? How did they get fresh water, fresh air? How did they get light down to the third deck? And there's things for people of all ages to learn. And there's a petting zoo out there as well where you can see exotic animals and ride some of them. So encourage you to come to the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum if you haven't already. Well, tonight we're talking about Noah's flood in this first session. And I call it Noah's flood washing away millions of years, because we really need to see the connection between the flood and the age of the earth. I've had the privilege of speaking in 27 countries, and I have found that most Christians never even think about the flood when they think about the creation evolution controversy, and especially the age of the earth. But the flood is critical to this question. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon? Any of you? Oh, quite a few of you. I've had the privilege of going there about 19 times, usually floating down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, which is a great experience. But whenever you stand at the south rim and you look at that canyon and you see those rock layers that are as flat as pancakes and they extend as far as you can see, and then that huge hole in the ground, which is 280 miles long, 4 to 18 miles wide, and 1 mile deep, and you have to ask the question and wonder, when and how was all this formed? Was it formed by a little bit of water trickling through the Colorado River that carved that canyon over millions of years? That's what the national park and the geologists at the national park tell the 6 million visitors every year. Or was it the result of a lot of water over a very short period of time, which is what creation scientists believe? Well, when you look at those rock layers up close, you find that there are some fossils in those rock layers, and there are more rock layers on top of those as you go north and east, and they have fossils in them. And the evolutionists picture that geological record of rock layers and fossils with charts similar to this, where they picture the evolution of life from very simple bottom-dwelling creatures all the way up through amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, and people. Now, one thing you need to know is that does not actually exist anywhere in the world except in textbooks. There's no place where you can drill down through the rocks and find that nice, neat progression. In fact, there are sea creatures all the way through that fossil record. 95% of the fossils are sea creatures. Corals, shellfish, and fish, and shark's teeth, and brachiopods, and all kinds of things. There is a general pattern, but that can be explained by the flood as well, we think even better than the millions of years. But the evolutionists say that from the first living cell up to the present is about 3.5 billion years. Just an enormous amount of time. And most Christians today in all the countries I've been in have accepted the millions of years, or they don't know what to do with it, and then they just ignore the issue. And in most cases, they don't ever really think about Noah's flood. But it's really important. And there have been 4 views of Noah's flood in the history of the church. The first 1,800 years, the almost universal belief was that Noah's flood was a historical global catastrophe. It really happened in history. Just like George Washington was president of the United States, Noah built an ark. It was a global flood. When the water reached the highest level, it covered the whole planet. There was no dry ground anywhere. And it was a catastrophe of unimaginable destructive power. But about 200 years ago, the idea of millions of years was developed by deist and atheist geologists who rejected the biblical account of creation and the flood. And many Christians, not understanding the biblical text, not even looking carefully at the biblical text, and not understanding that the millions of years idea didn't come from the rocks and the fossils, but it came from anti-biblical ideas imposed on the geological evidence, those Christians started to reinterpret the Genesis flood. And some said it was a historical local catastrophe in the Mesopotamian valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it's just described in exaggerated language in the Bible. Another Christian approach was that it was a historical, global, peaceful flood. It was so peaceful, it left no geological evidence. And then there was the liberal theological view that Genesis 1 to 11 is mythology. These events never happened. The flood never happened. And really, a historical, global, peaceful flood is just a conservative Christian's way of saying that it was a myth. I could give a whole lecture on why this was a historical event. I won't do that tonight. But I want to give you some of the biblical and then some of the geological evidence that this was a global catastrophe. And we'll begin with the biblical evidence. And this is just some of the biblical evidence. We don't have time to discuss it all. But the first point is the purpose of the flood. Yes, the average person, why did God send the flood? They'll say, well, it was to destroy sinful man. Well, that's true, but only partly true. Genesis 6 tells us, the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air. For it repenteth me that I have made them. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the purpose of the flood was not simply to destroy sinful man, but to destroy all the land animals, all the birds, and the surface of the earth itself. And only a global flood would accomplish that purpose. Because a local flood in the Middle East is not going to kill any animals or birds in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Russia, China, or Australia. Only a global flood will accomplish that purpose. And it's significant to note that it mentions the birds because, in fact, in these next 3 chapters, it mentions the birds 18 times. God really wants us to know he's going to destroy the birds. Well, that leads us then to the purpose of the ark. And the purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. Genesis is very clear. They were to take 2 of every kind of unclean animal and 7 pairs of the clean animals. Why? To keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. If the flood was local, there was no need for the ark. Because the animals outside the flood zone didn't need to go in an ark. And the animals in the flood zone, the birds would fly out of that area. to another mountaintop. And animals sense natural disaster before it happens. They would leave the area. Even if they all died, the animals that lived outside the flood zone could migrate in and repopulate the area. So no need to build the ark for the animals. And as for Noah, it really was a ridiculous building project, because all God would have had to do is say what he said to Mary and Joseph. Go on a vacation to Europe. I'll tell you when to come back. The ark was only necessary if it was a global flood. And as soon as we mention the ark, non-Christians, of course, scoff. But sadly, some Christians scoff. And they say, well, there's no way you could fit all the animals in that ark. Well, you couldn't fit the animals in that ark, but it wasn't a little floating bathtub with giraffes sticking their heads out the top. And so we need to get that idea out of our heads. But we also need to get that idea out of our Sunday school curriculum and out of the books we pick out from the library, because that's the ark that is presented to the children over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And if that's the only picture of the ark that the kids see, when they get old enough to think about it, they're going to think there's no way you could fit all the animals in that ark. So the story of the flood must be a story, a fairy tale, like Hansel and Gretel and the Tooth Fairy. So from the very earliest ages, we need to give them a picture of the dimensions that the Bible gives. It was about 1.5 football fields long, about a half a football field wide, and about 4 stories tall. It's often been pictured in Christian art as a barge, but engineers tell us it's very, very difficult to make square corners out of wood and have them be really strong. And furthermore, scientists have done some research with models of a barge-shaped ark, and it just naturally turns sideways into the water. But when they make an ark like that, which is very similar in its design to many of the ancient ships in the ancient world, with a wind catcher at the front, a keel in the back, that design just causes the boat to stay perpendicular to the waves. It had 3 decks, and we can calculate the volume capacity of the ark from the dimensions given in Genesis 6. It was equivalent to about 450 18-wheeler semis, a huge, huge volume. And in the research for the building of the ark that we did, we calculated that there were probably only about 1,400 kinds of land animals and birds that went on the ark. They didn't have to take 2 of every species. They didn't take 2 of every variety of dogs. Didn't take 2 poodles and 2 Great Danes and 2 wolves and 2 German shepherds. They just took 2 of the dog kind. And similar with other kinds of creatures. So only about 7,000 animals on the ark, and there was plenty of room. Well, the purpose of the flood and the purpose of the ark speak of the globality of the flood. What about the character of the flood? Well, if the purpose was to destroy not only people, land animals, and birds not in the ark, but the surface of the earth itself, it would have to be destructive. And so it was. But there are a couple of verses that really bring this out. We have time to only talk about one. That's in Genesis 7:11, where we read, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. Now that tells you right there, we're not reading a fairy tale, we're reading history. It's giving us the exact day of Noah's life that this happened. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were open. So the Bible tells us there were 2 sources for the water. A lot of Christians think just one. And a lot of Christians think it just rained for 40 days and 40 nights, because that's what the next verse says. But if you read on, you find out that it actually rained until the 150th day, when God closed the windows of heaven. And the 40 days is probably a reference to how long it was before the ark started to float. But this was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain that it was an expression of the wrath of God against a sinful world. This was Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Katrina type rain, globally. And that alone would be catastrophic, because if there was any slope to the land, the soil would quickly become supersaturated with water, and you would have mudslides that make the mudslides in Southern California every year look like a Sunday school picnic on a sunny day. But that probably wasn't the primary source of water, because it's not mentioned first here in Genesis 7:11, and it's not mentioned first in chapter 8, verse 2, when God closed the fountains of the deep and closed the windows of heaven. So the fountains of the great deep are probably the primary source of water. And the great deep usually refers to the ocean in the Bible. So the fountains of the great deep are subterranean waters coming into the ocean. And the word fountains implies under high pressure, and since it's coming from inside the earth, it's reasonable to assume it was also under high temperature. And then we have in English two words there, broken up. That's a translation of one Hebrew word. It's an interesting word, used several other times in the Old Testament. It's used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against the leadership of Moses. And God says to the children of Israel, I want you to move away from Korah and his family and their livestock and their tents. And the Bible says the ground opened, and their tents and their livestock and their families went into the earth. It was a small earthquake. The same word is used in Zechariah 14:4, a promise about the second coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And it says that his feet will touch the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the mountain will split in two, same Hebrew word, and a huge valley will form. So this one Hebrew word is loaded with geological significance, because it's telling us that at the beginning of the flood, and for the next 150 days, the crust of the earth was breaking apart in many places. Now, if you have an earthquake, you will often have a volcano. Most volcanoes are actually triggered by an earthquake. And if you have an earthquake or a volcano on the ocean floor, what are you going to produce? Well, you're going to produce a tsunami. And we know what tsunamis do. That tsunami in Japan a few years ago, if you've never gone on Google and searched for the tsunami in YouTube, you can watch, because they had helicopters flying over the ocean as it rolled over the land, destroying everything in its path. So just imagine, you have earthquakes and volcanoes going off on the ocean floor, setting off tsunamis, not just one on one day, but repeatedly over 150 days. You have a catastrophe of unimaginable violence, and anything not in the ark would perish. The water didn't instantly cover the earth. It took days, it took weeks for the water to finally completely cover the landmass. So creatures which could run to higher ground would, but eventually there wouldn't be any higher ground, and they'd be swept away, and many of them would be buried in sediments. Then we have the height of the flood. The Bible's crystal clear here. In Genesis 7, it says, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Now, since water seeks a level plain, if you're going to cover all the high mountains under the heavens, you're going to have a global flood, because water will always go down to the lowest level. If I had a miraculous bottle of water here, and you were all mountains, and I came down and started pouring water on one of the mountains, well, you know what would happen. The water would just pile up on the top of their head and go up to the ceiling, right? No, it would go down on the carpeting. And if I wanted to cover all the mountains in this room for a couple of months, I'd have to pour a lot of water, because the doors to the auditorium are not watertight, and the doors to the church are not watertight. So the water's going to leak out. We're going to have to flood all of Elkhart. We're going to have to flood South Bend, Chicago. It's going to keep going down south. We're going to flood a lot of America, and it's not going to stop when it gets to the coast. It's going to keep going. We're going to flood New York, London, Tokyo. Water always seeks a level plain, except when it's in a bottle. So the idea of a local flood, if you believe in a local flood, that's what you have to believe in. Now, I will freely admit that's not a photograph. That's actually 6 photographs, some of them turned on their side by one of our clever artists. But you could never have a flood like that. that would just cover the mountains in one area, unless God supernaturally put his hands around the Middle East and blocked every single mountain pass. But there's nothing in Genesis 6-9 that indicates that God was containing the waters of the flood. The text is going out of its way to indicate this was a global flood. Well, one other biblical evidence that I want to mention, and that is the rainbow promise in Genesis 9. When God promises that never again will he send a flood, and he said the sign of that promise is the rainbow. And we need to note the promise. Who was it made to? Well, it was made to Noah and all of his descendants. But it was also made to all the animals and the birds and all their offspring. And it was made to the earth itself. And only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. Because if the flood was local, God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have killed some animals, some people, and destroyed some of the earth. Only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. Now, what would you expect to find from a global flood that lasted 371 days from the day the flood began until Noah departed from the ark? Well, you'd expect to find billions of dead things that were buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments of silt, sand, clay, mud. You'd expect to find evidence that those rock layers, those sediments, were deposited by water, not in a desert. And you'd expect to find evidence of this all over the earth if it was a global flood. And the miracle of miracles is that's exactly what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. We find marine fossils on the tops of the highest mountains. The Himalayas. Mount Everest has marine creatures up there. How'd they get there? They weren't washed up there. The major mountain ranges are all made of sedimentary rocks that have been folded and bent and thrust up. Those layers are once horizontal. The layers at the top of the Grand Canyon are 8,000 feet above sea level. There are sea creatures in those rock layers. Now, for the last 200 years, the evolutionists have been telling us that it's a scientific fact that fossil record, which is a record not only of death, but we see evidence of disease and killing and thorns and extinction, that's the record of millions of years of history on this planet. But really, most of it is the evidence of Noah's flood. And so we want to look at some of the geological evidence for that. Now, if you were here last night, you heard me talk about where this idea of millions of years came from. So this is just a review. For those of you who weren't, I have a lecture, a DVD of that lecture that you can pick up. But back in the early 19th century, we had three competing views of Earth history. We had the traditional biblical view that the church had believed for 1,800 years, and it was defended by a group of writers who collectively became known as the scriptural geologists. They weren't all geologists. Some were very knowledgeable in geology, some were not, but that was the label they got. And they were defending the biblical view of history. A supernatural creation week, a global flood at the time of Noah, and all of that happening only a little more than 6,000 years ago. And then there was the catastrophist view, which said that the rock layers and fossils were the result of a series of major catastrophic floods, each of them separated by long periods of time. And in each event, God either supernaturally created new creatures to replace what had died, or survivors repopulated the earth. And then there was the uniformitarian view, advocated by James Hutton and Charles Lyell, and they said, no, there have not been any catastrophic floods of a continental or global scale, but the processes of geological change have just been slow and gradual, just a particle at a time, erosion by wind and rain, breaking off little particles that get carried into the creeks, which get carried into the rivers, which get dumped on the ocean floor, and then through convulsions every so often, some of that land gets brought above sea level. It's just slow, gradual erosion and sedimentation. Well, by about 1840, those first two views were rejected. And the uniformitarian view became the ruling view in geology. But 1840 is also about the time that geology became a degree at the university. Before that, you could take a geology course, but you couldn't get a degree in geology. And about 1840 is when geology became a paid profession. Before that, people were just geologists as a hobby, and it was mainly limited to people who were independently wealthy who could trounce around in the land looking at rock layers and fossils. But by 1840, everyone who went to the university to study geology, all the geological societies that had developed, they were all controlled by this uniformitarian thinking. Slow, gradual processes will explain all the rocks of the earth. And that's the DVD that is the lecture that I gave last night, and you can learn more about that there. So that idea of uniformitarianism took control of geology and controlled geology and geological education for about 130 years. And then in the 1970s, something very unexpected happened. Some evolutionary geologists began to go back to the ideas of the catastrophists of the early 19th century. They rejected the uniformitarian thinking, and they became open to catastrophe. And I think, I don't know, but I think when I get to heaven, we'll be able to find out that a book published by two creationists, Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, in 1961, entitled The Genesis Flood, probably had some influence on some of these thinkers. But one of these new catastrophists, an evolutionist, was Derek Ager. He was a very famous British geologist, head of the geology department at the University College of Swansea in Wales. He was one-time president of the British Geological Association. He wrote 4 books on geology. He wrote over 200 technical papers on geology. He visited over 50 countries of the world studying geological formations. And in the last book he wrote, he had a warning in the preface to people like me, creationists, not to use any information from his books to support our view. But he's dead now, so I do it all the time. Because what he said is really good, really revealing, and true. This is a quote from one of his earlier books where he's writing about the nature of the strata, the rock layers of the earth. He's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, and he has a short chapter on the history of geology, and he's looking back at the early 19th century. And I want you to listen to what he has to say, and then I'm going to illustrate. He said, "My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians." In his mind, those were the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political of their day, history of their day, more than by observations in the field. In other words, their thinking as geologists was more controlled by social and political ideas in their heads than by what they were actually seeing in the rocks. He went on, "In other words, we have allowed ourselves to be," what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. Well, what's he talking about? He's saying, look, when we went to high school and took our first geology class, we were taught to think like uniformitarians. Slow, gradual processes will explain everything you see in the rocks. We went off to the university. We majored in geology. And our professors taught us slow, gradual processes will explain everything you see in the rocks. We got our PhDs under the same education. We were brainwashed. We could not consider catastrophe as an explanation for what we were seeing. Well, he graduated and he went out to those 50-some countries, and the more he looked at rocks, the more he saw evidence of catastrophe. And the last book he wrote, published just after he died, was entitled The New Catastrophism. Well, I want to illustrate brainwashing, and I have a pop quiz. It's a one-question exam, and it's a multiple choice. So here's the question. Here you have 2 curved yellow lines, and the question is, what's missing? What was it originally? Was it A? Was it B? Was it C? Or was it D? Who thinks it was A? B? C? D? How many of you are afraid to answer the question? You're cowards. All right, well, grade the exam right now, and the correct answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Oh, why did you think something was missing? Oh, because I asked you a question, what's missing? And you thought, well, he wouldn't ask what's missing if something's not missing. So I've got to figure out what's missing and put it into the picture. See, I controlled the way you thought about those two curved yellow lines just by putting a question into your head. Dr. Ager said we were brainwashed so we couldn't see evidence of catastrophe. His last book, The New Catastrophism, was full of examples of rock formations that traditionally had been interpreted as forming over millions of years, and he believed from his study of the evidence they were formed in a matter of months, weeks, days, hours, minutes. One of the examples in the book was the Sutton Stone, which is a conglomerate. It's a rock layer made up of pebbles of various sizes that are rounded. And they were ripped up from somewhere else, and as they were transported by water to this new location, all the sharp edges and corners were rounded off, and then it was re-cemented together. He said this about this formation very close to his home in Wales. This has usually been interpreted as the basal conglomerate of a diachronous transgressive sea, the sea coming over the land and receding, and over the land and receding. It has been suggested with very little fossil evidence that this conglomerate spans 3 to 5 ammonite zones, those are shell creatures in the ocean, and therefore up to 5 million years in time. That's how long it took to form this conglomerate. But as he studied it, he came to the conclusion, I think it was deposited in a matter of hours or minutes. Wow, that's a big difference in interpretation. 5 million years versus hours or minutes. What changed? The rocks didn't change. The interpretation changed because he had become open to catastrophe as an explanation. And once he was opened his mind to that, he began to look more carefully at the rocks, and he saw in the rocks the evidence of not time, but catastrophe. And so what we need to understand is that all the geologists have the same rocks and fossils to study. But if they have anti-biblical assumptions, if they say this book is written by a bunch of primitives, Jews and Christians, and Genesis 1 to 11, that's a bunch of mythology. That's not history. There never was a global flood. The earth isn't just a few thousand years old. God didn't create in 6 days. If you have those assumptions, you go and look at those rocks and you'll think, well, it must have taken a long time to carve the Colorado River, and much longer to lay down all those layers. And so you come up with the idea of an old earth and global flood. And that's what happened 200 years ago. People didn't show that the Bible was wrong. They just ignored the Bible. And then they assumed that time was the hero of the plot. But geologists back in the early 19th century and geologists today who take this as God's eyewitness testimony, they go out and look at the very same rocks and fossils, and they see all kinds of evidence for a young earth and global flood. And so we're going to look at some of that. How long does it take to make fossils? Well, the first thing you need to know is that when they dig up a fossil, it doesn't have a label on it saying how old it is. And they don't date the fossils by any of the dating methods, radiometric dating methods. In fact, they don't even date the layers that the fossils are in with those dating methods. We'll talk about those methods in a minute. But here's an interesting statement about fossilization by two evolutionists in a book on dinosaurs. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now, you need to stop and think about that sentence. How do they know it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? Has there ever been a geologist who's watched a bone change into stone over millions of years? No. Could you get a whole group of scientists to overlap their scientific careers so they could say, well, collectively we have observed this? No. Geology's only been a science for about 200 years. So how do they know it happens over millions of years? The answer is very easy. They don't. It's an assumption. How do they know it happens in a few hours? Now we're talking observational science. They go on. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. Not months, not years, not centuries or millennia, certainly not millions of years, weeks. What do you have to have for this to happen? Well, they tell you, groundwater heavily laden with minerals in solution. Can you think of any event in the Bible where you might have a lot of groundwater heavily laden with minerals in solution? Yeah, Noah's flood, the fountains of the great deep. We have fountains on the ocean floor today. They're rich in minerals. And as the waves crash onto the land, pulverizing rock, you're going to have all kinds of minerals in solution. And Noah's flood didn't happen a few weeks ago. It happened a little over 4,500 years ago. The fossils themselves speak of rapid burial and fossilization. Here is an ichthyosaur caught in the act of giving birth. The baby barely out, mom and baby hit with a sediment-choked wave of water, buried alive. And before the microorganisms and oxygen in the water could destroy all the evidence, they were fossilized. Here's a fish caught in the act of eating lunch, didn't even get to finish swallowing. 2 turtles caught in the act of mating. Charles Darwin said, "No organism wholly soft can be preserved in the fossil record." Well, Charlie was wrong about a lot of things. He was wrong about that. Here's a fossilized worm found in China, no hard parts. And here's something that really had to fossilize quickly. It's called coprolite. It's fossilized animal manure. Well, how long does it take to form and erode rocks? When I was working on my PhD in England, I read about some research on the east coast of England. The title of the article in the newspaper was "Magic in the Marsh." Without any regard to the laws of geology, mud on the marsh is hardening into stone in a few years rather than the thousands it usually takes. Now let's stop and think about that sentence again. How do they know it usually takes thousands of years for rock to form? And the answer is, they don't. That's an assumption. That's not a scientific observation. How do they know it happens in a few years? That's scientific observation. Professor Coleman, the geologist who was working on this, said the rock was forming faster than anybody had ever believed possible. See what the problem was? Their belief system. They were surprised. I wasn't surprised. They go on. With one stone creating itself in just 6 months, they often contain beautifully preserved fossils where the detail of the soft flesh of the creature is caught, as well as the bone, as it had no time to rot before the rock formed around it. What was going on here? Well, they studied the mud under the microscope, and they found that there were bacteria in the mud that were eating things in the mud and producing a waste product that was the cementing agent to turn the mud into stone. So all you need is the right chemicals in solution, and you can make stone really quickly. And of course, you know this. It doesn't take millions of years to make a freeway. And what's a freeway made out of? Man-made rock. We call it concrete. What about erosion? Well, the Scablands in eastern Washington is a beautiful area of 15,000 square miles of rolling hills and valleys cut right into solid basalt, a massive lava deposit. And for decades, the scientific community told tourists and in textbooks that this was carved over millions of years of slow, gradual erosion. But you can go to even evolutionary websites today that say that most of this was carved by floodwaters in 1 to 2 days in solid rock. And the story of the change in interpretation is told by the late Dr. Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University, an evolutionist. The area we're talking about is here in eastern Washington, and there was a geologist out there in the 1920s by the name of J. Harlan Bretz. He was an evolutionist. He believed in millions of years, but as he walked in this area and studied the rocks, he became convinced that this area was eroded catastrophically. He published his first article in a geological journal in 1923. Immediately, the geological community attacked. They called him names. They said it was an outrageous hypothesis, and they totally rejected it. He didn't know where the water came from. He speculated maybe from the north. But it was a few years later, another geologist was working in Montana where there's geological evidence of a lake called Lake Missoula. The lake isn't there, but the geological evidence that it was there in the past. And this geologist said, I think I found the water for the Scablands erosion. And he proposed that there was an ice dam at the northwest end of that lake that was blocking a narrow valley. And as the ice age, the last ice age in the evolutionary view, the only ice age in a creationist view, as the ice retreated into Canada, that dam gave way and that whole lake drained through what is now the Scablands with water moving at 100 miles an hour, carrying boulders the size of automobiles and small houses, and just scouring that landscape. Well, it was another few years before the geological community finally agreed with Dr. Bretz and eventually gave him their highest award. But Dr. Gould tells us this about the change in thinking. The establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition to Bretz when he first published. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. Well, what was that? Uniformitarianism. You can't be right because everything must be explained by slow, gradual processes. Brett stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism or uniformitarianism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. So this idea of uniformitarianism was like a dogma, like a doctrine that nobody could question. And we like to illustrate it with a pair of glasses because it was a set of assumptions through which people looked at the world. And all the geologists are wearing these glasses. A lot of Christian geologists are wearing these glasses because you get these glasses when you go to kindergarten. Then you get a larger pair of glasses when you get to grade school, larger pair of glasses when you get to high school and on into college. And you're looking at the world through these evolutionized millions of years glasses, trying to explain the world. But Christians should not look at the world through those glasses. We should look at the world through biblical glasses, through the eyewitness testimony of the Creator in His Word. And when we do, we see things that others miss. Now, let me illustrate with my own glasses. I have bifocals, and so I'm able to do scientific experiments with my glasses when I'm out speaking. I can look at the people in the back of the room through my bottom lenses, and I can tell you that it is an empirical, observational, scientific fact. Those people have heads, but they don't have eyes. I mean, if you could look through my bottom lenses, you'd see that's true. I look through my top lenses. Oh, they have eyes as well as heads. What's changed? Well, the people haven't changed. It's my interpretation that changed because of the lenses that I was looking through. And most geologists, including most Christian geologists today, are looking at the world through evolutionized glasses, and they say there is absolutely no evidence for a global flood. The rocks are screaming millions of years. If they put on the right glasses, if they would believe God's eyewitness testimony in His Word, they'd see it. Well, let me show you a short video from our Creation Museum, which features Dr. Andrew Snelling on our staff, who has a PhD in geology from the University of Sydney in Australia and has done geological research on 4 continents.
Rock layers are visible in mountains, plateaus, and canyons all over the world. Where did these rock layers come from? Present processes aren't the answer. Today, Sand and mud are usually deposited in thin layers along the outer edge of continents, and the formation of fossils today is rare. But somehow in the past, thick layers of sand and mud were spread across entire continents and filled with well-preserved fossils. Noah's flood suggests a way to explain these puzzling features. Flooding the continents, for example, could carry sea creatures many hundreds of feet above present sea level. Andrew Snelling is a PhD geologist from Australia who has spent over 30 years studying rocks, working in the field and in the lab.
We find marine creatures buried at the top of the Grand Canyon, which is over a mile above sea level.
A global flood could carry sand and mud enormous distances.
Some of the sand grains that are in the Navajo sandstone had to have come from the Appalachians. But what river or what process today is carrying material from the Appalachians to the southwest?
A global flood could quickly lay down thick layers of mud and sand, burying even giant animals and tall trees.
We've got coal beds with trees sitting on them, and these trees, tree stumps, go through many strata, which means that before they could rot, you had to have lots of sand and mud coming in quickly. Several places in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet of different types of sand and mud and lime have been bent, and they've been bent while they're still soft. Both the bottom layer and the top layer are all bent the same way, which means that the whole sequence of 4,000 feet of sand and mud and lime had to have been laid down very quickly by the waters and then bent very soon afterwards.
A global flood could form thick layers across entire continents.
In the Grand Canyon area, we've got limestone bed, the red wall limestone. The same limestone can be found over here in the eastern United States.
A global flood could cut deeply and widely.
We've got this huge flat surface at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which goes for thousands of square miles, where waters on a great scale over a vast area just swept over it and swept everything clean.
None of these processes, deep, wide erosion, or thick, rapid layering, or continent-wide distribution, or lifting of marine organisms above sea level, or sand carried across continents, occur in the present. Radically different processes are required, such as occurred during Noah's flood.
What about carbon dating and other radioisotope dating methods? Well, the first thing you need to know is that carbon dating is never used to date rocks, except by creationists. But evolutionists never use it because the maximum you could date anything by carbon dating is 80 to 100,000 years, and whatever you're dating has to have carbon in it. Most of the rock layers don't have carbon in them, but most of the rock layers, the evolutionists believe, are millions and tens and hundreds of millions of years old. So they never use carbon dating to date rocks or fossils. They use other dating methods, and we'll mention those in just a moment. But there's good reasons not to trust the dating methods, and this is just one example. Mount St. Helens was a beautiful mountain in May 1980 in Washington State. It erupted on May 18th. It blew off about a third of the mountaintop that day, and in the crater of the volcano, lava oozed and produced a lava dome and hardened into rock. About 12 years after the initial eruption, after everything had settled down, Dr. Steve Austin, who is a PhD in geology from Penn State University, climbed up onto the mountain to that lava dome, got samples, took them back to the lab, prepared them the way his professors taught him, sent them off to a radiometric dating laboratory. He did not tell them where he got the rocks. He wanted a blind analysis. He simply said they were recent. They applied 4 different methods to dating these rocks, and the results came back. These rocks are 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. Well, what are these methods supposed to tell you? They're supposed to tell you when the lava came out of the ground and hardened into rock. But we know how old these rocks are. They were all less than 12 years old when they were dated. And there are many, many examples in the published technical literature where they take rocks of known age, where there were human eyewitnesses to see the volcano erupt, to see the lava come out of the ground, and the dating methods don't work. They give ages of hundreds of thousands or millions of years for rocks that are only decades or centuries old. But the evolutionists want us to believe that when they take rocks of unknown age, where there were no human eyewitnesses to see that that lava come out of the ground, they want us to assume that the dating methods work. But if they don't work on the rocks we do know the age of, why should we trust them on the rocks we don't know the age of? We shouldn't. Well, I want to show you a video from a clip from this video called Check This Out. It has 6 mini videos on these various topics, one of them being radiometric dating. And I want to show you that because it'll help you to understand how this works.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life. That is the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
Okay. If that came at you too fast, you can get the video and watch it again. But the key word there is assumptions. Scientists, as they look at the past, as they try to reconstruct the past, are only looking at the present. And they have to make assumptions about processes going on in the past that the processes they observe today, the processes of change, whether it's erosion, whether it's sedimentation, whether it's radioactive decay, they have to assume it's always gone on in the past at the same rate and frequency as they observe today. But that's an assumption. That's not a scientific observation. So if you go to the Grand Canyon, they'll tell you at the national park, they'll tell you that it took 300 million years to lay down those layers, and it took 1 to 5 to 70 million years for the Colorado River to cut the Grand Canyon. But if you read carefully, they don't really know how the Colorado River did that. But really, it's not the evidence of millions of years. It's the evidence of Noah's flood. And so I like to call this lecture Noah's flood washing away millions of years, because Noah's flood is responsible for producing most of the rock layers and fossils. There are some sediments at the bottom that don't have fossils that are pre-flood deposits, and there are some sediments at the top that are more localized in their extent that have fossils in them. Those are post-flood deposits, but most of the geological record is the result of the flood. And so there is no evidence for millions of years. The flood really washes it away. Just to put it another way, to make it clear, the geological record of rock layers and fossils either was formed before Adam or after Adam. There's no other place to put it. If it was formed before Adam, then you've got to say that all of that death, disease, killing, suffering, extinction was very good. Because Genesis 1 says God looked at everything that he had made and it was very good. If we believe that it happened after Adam, then the most logical cause for most of it is Noah's flood. So if we accept the millions of years, we're going to have to reject Noah's flood. And that's why most Christians who accept millions of years don't accept Noah's flood as a global flood, or maybe even as a historical flood. There are some who do believe in the global flood of Noah and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through, because you can't believe in both of those things. If you believe what God's word says about Noah's flood, then you must reject the millions of years, because the flood could not have happened and left no geological evidence. And yet the geological community says there's no evidence of a global flood. Well, if the evidence is so strong for the flood, why don't people believe it? Well, I think there's several reasons. One is in Romans chapter 1. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The Bible says that sin darkens the mind. It will cause really smart people with PhDs after their name to think really strange ideas. Now, sin won't darken your mind if you're thinking about unimportant questions like, should I have Cheerios or Wheaties for breakfast tomorrow? Should I wear my brown socks or my black socks to work tomorrow? Sin probably won't affect that decision. But if you're thinking about really important questions like, is there a God to whom I am morally accountable? Where did I come from? Why am I here? What will happen to me when I die? If you're thinking about those questions, or if you're trying real hard not to think about those questions, sin will darken the mind, and it will cause really smart people to think strange things. So that's the reason why I believe most people don't believe in Noah's flood and believe in millions of years. But there's another reason. In the words of Derek Ager, we've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed. And we've all been brainwashed to some extent, because we've all gone to the same schools, the same museums, the same state and national parks. We've watched the same television programs in science. And so we've all heard millions of years all our life. And we've heard it in every country. It's the same thing being taught in every country. And not only is there brainwashing, there's censorship of the creationist view. You notice what happens when a local school board or a state wants to put stickers in the textbooks that the theory of evolution is just a theory and it should be open to criticism. What happens? The ACLU threatens a lawsuit, and They shut that idea down. Now think about this. If evolution in millions of years is really scientific fact, why do they need to threaten a lawsuit? It should be able to stand on its own. Why are they afraid of opposing ideas? I was a math teacher, a math major, and if I'd gone on to be a math teacher and a young man came to me in my 6th grade math class and he said, "Mr. Mortenson, can I have time tomorrow in class to give my argument for why 2 plus 2 is 5? I would not call the principal. I would not call the ACLU and threaten to sue the dad. I'd say, "Johnny, that would be great. You come tomorrow and present your argument. That'll be very educational for all of us." And I wouldn't need to and I wouldn't want to belittle him or criticize him. I'd let him present his argument. And then we would talk about it as a class. And we would help him and the other students to realize, no, there's some flaws in his thinking. And then we could commend Johnny and say, "Johnny, and the rest of you students, I want to commend Johnny. He's been thinking. He's been doing some thinking. And that's an example for all of you. Now, he made a mistake, but he's thinking. Johnny, keep thinking." That's what they could do. But no, they don't do that because evolution and millions of years are not science. They're an ideology. They're a philosophy masquerading as science, and they don't dare let criticisms of the idea into the classroom. That's what's going on. It's censorship. And if a creationist wants to teach at a secular university, he better not ever let anyone know he's a creationist because he'll lose his job or he won't even get hired. He has to be careful even if he's in a PhD program because he might get dropped out of the PhD program. That's what we're dealing with. Well, it's not just lay people. It's not just geologists who are brainwashed. So are our theologians because they go to the same schools, watch the same programs on science. Gleason Archer taught at the seminary that I attended, although he was retired by the time I got there. I have this book in my library, very helpful book. From a superficial reading of Genesis 1, he said, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. He didn't believe that. He believed in the day-age view. He died a few years ago. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, a questionable deduction, as will be presently shown. Well, he goes on a couple pages later to talk about some biblical arguments for rejecting the literal days, which I find totally inadequate. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is right here in the rest of the sentence. This seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. Notice his choice of words, scientific research. No, it wasn't the scientific research, Dr. Archer. It was the anti-biblical assumptions that were used to interpret some of the evidence that was gleaned from the research. Dr. Archer didn't understand where the millions of years idea came from. And he was a strong opponent of those of us who hold to a young earth creationist view, even accusing us of undermining the inerrancy of Scripture. You see, for 200 years, the scientific community has been telling the world, the Bible is not true. These rock layers show that the earth is millions of years old. You have to believe me, I'm a scientist. And most of our theologians over the last 200 years have said, well, we'll just have to accept the millions of years and add it to the Bible. And so they've come up with the gap theory, the day-age view, the framework hypothesis, theistic evolution. But the issue is not science. The issue is what glasses we're wearing. The issue is, what is our authority? Is it the infallible word of our holy God, who never makes any mistakes, who always knows everything, who always tells the truth? Or is our authority the fallible opinions of sinful men, some of whom are called geologists, who don't know everything, who make mistakes, who are controlled by anti-biblical ideas, most of them still in rebellion against their Creator? It's really a critical issue of authority in the church today. And much of the church has sided with the scientific majority. And notice what I said, the scientific majority. It's not science versus the Bible. It's what the majority of scientists say against what the Bible says. It's not scientists against the Bible. It's the majority of scientists. But the majority of scientists are not experts on radiometric dating. The majority of scientists are not geologists. So any geologist, any scientist of chemistry or biology or physics or medicine, he may be really smart and have a really high degree, but he's no more of an authority on geology or radiometric dating than you are. And so when we lump everybody together and say, well, most of the scientists say that the earth is millions of years old, well, most of the scientists are not qualified to comment on it any more than you are. So it's an issue of authority. And the scientists say the earth is billions of years old. Noah's flood never happened. Take my word for it. God says I created in 6,000 years ago and sent a global flood. Take my word for it. Christians have to decide whose word they're going to take. But it's not a choice between Bible and science, because real science confirms what God's word says. And Christians increasingly have to decide whether they're going to believe what God says or what an increasing number of evangelical theologians say, who believe what the secular geologists say rather than believing what God says. And we're bombarded with this millions of years idea all the time. You don't even realize how many times you're hearing it. We're in a war. It's a war of ideas. It's imaginations raised up against the knowledge of God. And so that's why the resources out there are so critical. Most Christians don't ever think about it. Most Christians never don't know what to do with these ideas, because all they've ever heard is what this scientific community wants them to hear. So that's why these resources of the Answers books for teens and adults, the Answers books for grade school kids, the Flood of Evidence, which is a new Answers book just dealing with the flood, answering about 40 questions about the flood, a great resource. And the Answers magazine, which is a great way to teach the biblical worldview, not just on the creation evolution issue, but other topics as well, teaching kids how to think biblically. And if you sign up for that, you get a free digital version of the magazine that you can search, and you also get one DVD free for each year that you subscribe, up to 3 years at this conference. So you can sign up for that. And this lecture is available if you want to watch it again or share it with somebody else. The lecture I gave last night on millions of years is available, and that's based on my PhD research, which this book is a shortened version of. And then Andrew Snelling has a video out there, lecture, illustrated lecture on the geological evidence for a young earth and a global flood. Check this out. Videos is a great resource, just 3 to 4 minute videos on 6 different topics, and really help people get an introduction to the truth that confirms Genesis. Andrew Snelling also has a 1-hour lecture on the radioactive dating methods, and that's for lay people to understand. He does a good job of explaining it, and he's done a lot of research on that particular area. We also have a video on the Ice Age, which we've just barely touched on, but the Bible, it's the global flood that explains the Ice Age. And Mike Ord is a retired meteorologist with the U.S. Weather Service who's done a lot of research on that. A whole video on Mount St. Helens and what we learned from that, and how catastrophic processes do things that geologists didn't think they could do. A video on Noah's Ark, and by Tim Lovett, who's an engineer who did a lot of research on ancient ships. He did some experimental research as an engineer on models of the flood, and his research is what went into our development of the Ark encounter. Young Earth by John Morris, who's a son of Henry Morris and longtime president of the Institute for Creation Research. Great introduction to the geological evidence for a young Earth. And then a book for preschoolers on the flood and for grade schoolers on the flood, and on flood legends. Over 200 legends around the world about a global flood. And many of them have the same elements of a man surviving in a boat with some animals, and some of them even talk about it being a global flood. So any of those books and DVDs you can combine together and make your own combinations. and save a lot of money that way. We still have the Begin book, which is Genesis 1 to 11, Exodus 20, the Gospel of John, the book of Romans, and the last 2 chapters of Revelation. Sandwiched between those scripture portions is a summary of the biblical history, tying it all together, and then it ends with an article that answers 10 of the most asked skeptical questions and presents the gospel. So a great little resource that's just $3 here. And if you haven't signed up for a free newsletter to stay in touch with Answers in Genesis, to pray for our ministry, to get updates on what's going on at the museum and new resources, you can sign up for that on our book tables. And we have over 10,000 articles on our website, and just about any question you could think of. Most of it understandable to lay people and students, but we also have stuff for little kids, and we have technical research there. And if you haven't been to the museum or ARC, pick up a brochure and make plans to attend. And if you haven't been to the Grand Canyon, or you went and all you did was listen to what the evolutionists say, go back and go with Canyon Ministries, either on a rim tour. They have half-day, full-day, and sunset tours with a guide that will explain the canyon from various places on the rim from a creationist perspective. And the really best way to do it is to go on one of their river trips. They have 4-day, 7-day, and 9-day river trips down through the canyon on the Colorado River, and that's the way to really see the impact of Noah's flood. Well, let me close this with a passage from Matthew 24. Jesus was asked about the signs of his second coming, and one of the signs he gave was related to the flood. He said, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. They were just going on with life as usual until the day that Noah entered into the ark and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So also shall the coming of the Son of Man be." So Jesus believed in the flood. He believed in the ark. He believed in Noah. And he said that judgment is a warning of the judgment to come. And so this is not just an interesting historical question. It's just not an interesting scientific question. It's a question of our eternal destiny. And if you're here tonight and you have not put your trust in Jesus Christ alone as your Lord and Savior, he is the ark to save us from the coming judgment, and there is no other ark. He is the door, and there is no other door. And so if you have not trusted in him, I urge you to do so. Well, we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and look at the Big Bang, exploding the myth. Thank you.